When South African President Cyril Ramaphosa visited the White House in the middle of May, President Trump repeatedly expressed his concern of a white genocide targeting the white population of South Africa. In an awkward public sit-down, President Trump would show off a series of videos and articles showing supposed evidence of such a genocide. So we thought we'd look into these instances ourselves and see what we could find. President Trump has made South Africa a foreign policy priority even in the early days of his second term, previously cutting off all aid or assistance to the nation. The aid cut was prompted following South Africa's recently passed land expropriation law. The controversial law, introduced at the beginning of January, allows the South African government to seize land from private owners if such an action is deemed to be in the public interest. While the law is primarily intended to enable the government to purchase land for the public good, it also includes specific provisions that allow for land to be seized without compensation in certain cases. This is designed to appropriate land which the owner has no intention of productively utilizing or maintaining, and it's more of a last resort to other avenues of negotiation. So far, there have been 0 cases of land being seized under this new law, but even the possibility of the law being abused has left it a controversial talking point even today. The reason why we're talking about this at all is all down to the demographic makeup of South Africa as a whole. Due to the turbo-racist policy of apartheid, which was abolished in 1990, South Africa's white population find themselves generally much wealthier than their black counterparts. Although making up around 7% of the population, white South Africans own 70% of the nation's land, which is why the Trump administration views the new laws as discriminatory towards the white population. White people aren't directly targeted, but they'll nevertheless be far more likely to be affected by this law. Regardless of the still controversial expropriation law, experts note that US aid cuts would lead to an estimated 500,000 aid-related deaths over the next decade. Now that we've properly set the stage, let's go back to the meeting at the White House, where we'll start with this moment.
White South African couples say that they were attacked violently.
President Trump, when will you go and see for yourself if it is indeed true?
Well, I could do that. Look, here's burial sites all over the place. These are all white farmers that are being buried. And he asks about a jet that was given. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. You know, you are so bad. You're such a bad reporter.
There's a lot to break down here, but the article Mr. Trump was holding up was published by The American Thinker. And if we're making a tier list of credible news sources, these guys would be right at the bottom. Not only does the website look like a fucking MySpace page, but the publication itself has had a long history of posting conspiracy theories and failing fact checks. The picture on the article that Trump was holding up in this clip wasn't even from South Africa. It was from the Democratic Republic of Congo. At another point in the meeting, President Trump would show a video depicting what he believed to be burial sites of thousands of white South African farmers killed in a supposed genocide. However, when BBC reporters visited this community, it was found that the crosses were a protest by local farmers, following the murder of white couple Glenn and Vida Rafferty. A common piece of evidence among those who echo South Africa's white genocide concerns is the frequent murder of white farmers within rural areas. This is where things get a bit murky, as South Africa doesn't factor race when it comes to crime statistics, nor does it have a specific category for farm murders. However, according to South Africa's Transvaal Agricultural Union, an organization sympathetic to white farmers, 56 white South Africans were killed on farms per year over the last 35 years. Depending on the statistics used, this would indicate that white farmers are twice as likely to get murdered than the national average within South Africa. Although clearly 56 too many, calling these figures a genocide is quite dishonest to the bigger picture. South Africa unfortunately has one of the highest murder rates in the world, and out of the 27,000 murders committed in 2023, only around 50 were white farmers. One explanation as to why the murder rate for white farmers is so high is the inherent isolation present within farming communities, which exacerbates the nation's already stretched law enforcement efforts. Gareth Newham, who heads a justice and violence prevention program at the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa, explains that where you live can greatly increase the likelihood of experiencing violent behavior. Newham explains that roughly half of all murders within South Africa take place in just 12% of precincts. He would comment, quote, "As an independent institute tracking violence and violent crime in South Africa, if there was any evidence of either a genocide or targeted violence taking place against any group based on their ethnicity, we would be among the first to raise the alarm and provide the evidence to the world." Newham would explain that while racially targeted violence does occur against South Africa's Africa's white population, it's very rare, only making up a few % of recorded cases. We should also keep in mind that genocide is actually a legally defined term, and the concept itself is relatively new. The term was first coined in 1943 in response to Germany's network of concentration camps. In 1948, the United States Genocide Convention would be signed, an international treaty that criminalizes and defines the act of genocide. To qualify as a genocide, the act must include two main elements. First is the mental element, which the UN defines as the, quote, intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethical, racial, or religious group. The second is the physical element, which can be made up of any of the following 5 acts: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The physical element is usually much easier to prove, meaning most of the time is spent trying to prove the mental condition. Particularly the intent to destroy means that violence against one of the above categories needs to be planned and targeted. Although it isn't stated in international law, case law has also associated intent with the existence of a state, or at the very least, an organizational plan or policy. We could likely talk for hours about the various debates over the term, whether the term is too narrow or ultimately who gets to make these calls. But the whole point is that genocide is supposed to be the biggest crime there is. The legal bar for proving it is so high because throwing the term around casually diminishes its meaning. As an example, Israel's war within Gaza has legitimately made the region hell on earth, but the International Criminal Court's investigation of Israel is still ongoing, because these cases usually take years to reach a conclusion. Ironically, the ICC case against Israel was brought to the court by South Africa. A genocide within South Africa would imply that there's been a targeted effort to kill the nation's white population. However, the evidence for such an effort has remained relatively weak. One piece of evidence was actually shown by President Trump in the same aforementioned meeting, which is a video depicting the leader of South Africa's economic freedom fighters, Julius Malema, singing the anti-apartheid song De Boel Ibhunu, or Kill the Boer. Boer is the Afrikaans word for farmer. However, it can be interpreted to mean kill the Afrikaner, the white Afrikaans-speaking ethnic group within South Africa. In terms of intent, having the leader of a prominent South African political party essentially sing kill the white farmer is the most damning evidence that President Trump brought to the meeting. It also doesn't help that when interviewed in 2016, Julius Malema would comment, "We're not calling for the slaughter of white people. For now." We should keep in mind, however, that the actions of the far-left Black Nationalist Party don't represent the views of the South African government. President Ramaphosa himself has also repeatedly condemned the statements made by Julius Malema. The sentiments of Malema are fortunately only shared by a minority of South Africans, but it shows a pretty shaky level of race relations within the country. In quite a controversial move, courts in South Africa have ruled that the Kill the Boer song does not constitute hate speech. Senior researcher at the University of Johannesburg, Anthony Casaboni, would explain why many have opposed the ruling, stating, "Some fear they may leave vulnerable groups without sufficient recourse when threatened." With this in mind, he also acknowledges that the courts have attempted to strike an impossible balance between the historical context, social cohesion, and the freedom of speech concerns. In his own words, "The courts have emphasized the need to understand the song within its historical and political context, not as a literal incitement to violence, but as a symbolic act of resistance embedded in the country's liberation struggle." For the courts of South Africa, this was clearly a difficult call to make. On the surface, the song can be interpreted as a pretty direct threat of violence. But on the other hand, there are people living in South Africa today who have lived through the oppressive policy of apartheid who are still in their 30s. Considering South Africa still has the highest levels of wealth inequality than anywhere on earth as a direct consequence of these inherently racist policies, you can see why the courts made such an allowance. However, we're not here to answer whether race relations in South Africa are going well, because it's pretty obvious the country has a long way to go. We're also not here to answer whether white farmers are getting murdered, because that's also an indisputable fact. We're here to see whether the claims of white genocide in South Africa have any merit. In our research, we couldn't find a single credible source who was able to find evidence of white genocide within South Africa. Not a single news organization, government department, genocide expert, or human rights group would say South Africa was experiencing white genocide. However, many did share concern around the nation's high rate of crime and wealth inequality. American public news broadcaster PBS would actually contact the White House asking for evidence of genocide taking place in South Africa, to which they responded with no data. As you've probably guessed, no sponsor wanted to touch this video with a 10-foot pole, and YouTube's algorithm is probably sending us straight to the Shadow Realm. This is why we'd like to thank our amazing Patreon supporters for basically letting us make whatever the fuck we want. If you'd like to support what we do and get your name in the end credits, a link to do so will be down below. Until next time, have a fucking good one.
Expropriation, 7 pounds, that's got much,